including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. To read the full notice of your rights and protections, please go to www.boston.org/MPO_NO_DISCRIMINATION. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you have one. After roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking on either the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Haim Kim via the chat box at hkim@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3678. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Haim Kim and PO staff at hkim@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3678. Jonathan, you want to call the roll?
Yes, sir. Mass DOT Chair.
This is David Moeller. I'm here.
Mass DOT Seat 2.
I'm not seeing John Bichardi, Marie Rose.
Okay. Mass DOT Highway Division.
John Romano here.
Thank you. MBTA.
Good morning. This is Laura Gilmore for the MBTA.
Thank you. Massachusetts Port Authority.
I'm not seeing Sarah Lee.
Okay. MAPC.
Good morning. This is Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board, present.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Is Advisory Council here.
Thank you. City of Boston, Boston Transportation Department.
Sorry, Jen Rowe, representing Mayor Michelle Wu and the Boston Transportation Department.
Thank you. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hello, Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA representing Mayor Wu in City of Boston.
Great. At-large city, City of Everett.
Jay Monty representing Mayor DiMaria in the City of Everett.
At-large city of Newton.
Good morning, David Kozis representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
Thank you. At-large town of Arlington.
Daniel Amstutz representing Select Board Chair Lynn Diggins for the town of Arlington.
At-large town of Brookline.
Heather Hamilton for the town of Brookline.
Intercore Committee, City of Somerville. I did see Tom Bent join earlier.
I'm asking Tom Bent to unmute.
Okay, I'll come back to him. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton. Can somebody unmute Austin, please?
Looks like Austin's in meeting, but we're not hearing anything.
Okay. I do see him here, so I will mark him as present. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giambetti, representing Mayor Charles Ziski in the Metro West region.
Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Nguyen, representing Mayor Michael Cahill for the North Shore Task Force.
Thank you. North Suburban Planning Council, Town of Burlington. Okay. I will.
It looks like Melissa is unmuting, but we're unable to hear her.
Okay. I will mark her as present for now. We'll come back. South Shore Coalition, Town of Hull.
Jennifer Constable, Town of Hull for the South Shore Coalition.
Thank you. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
I'm not seeing Peter Pelletier.
Okay. Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Chamber.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the town of Norwood, representing the Truck Sub region.
Okay. And I do see Massport, Sarah Lee has arrived.
Hi, yes, sorry for the delay. This is Sarah Lee from Massport. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I saw Tom Bent try to join again for the Intercore Committee.
Yep, Tom Bent, City of Somerville, representing Mayor Valentine in the Intercore.
Thank you. Ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Cassie Ostrander, Federal Highway.
And federal, thank you, Federal Transit Administration. And that calls the roll, Mr. Chair. I will note that Mr. Lambert from Brockton Area Transit has his hand raised.
Well, I always like to hear from Mr. Lambert. Mike, you got something you want to say?
No, just when public comment comes along, but otherwise, thank you for having me, and good to see everyone here, especially David, Jonathan, and Tom.
All right, stand by, Mike. Chair's report, I don't have one. Taken. Executive Director's report.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So first and foremost, I wanted to welcome the new, the returning really mostly members to the MPO board. Now that the elections have been concluded, we would like to announce that the City of Somerville was reelected to the Intercore Committee subregional seat, and we have Tom Bent and Brad Rawson as designees. The City of Framingham was reelected to the Metro West Collaborative seat, and we have Dennis Giambetti as the returning designee. And the Town of Acton was reelected to the Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, or known as MAGIC, seat. And Austin Saiganowicz also will continue to be our designee. And then the Town of Hull was elected for the first time to the South Shore Coalition seat. But Jennifer Constable is the chair as the Board of Selectmen for the Town of Hull. And our designee, if not Jennifer, will be determined. So I wanted to just take a moment first to welcome back and welcome these members of the board, and also to say thank you very much to the board members who take the sort of the lead role on running the elections, which is the Vice Chair, Eric Barassa of MAPC, and Brian Kane of the MBTA Advisory Board. So with that, I can pause for a moment if anyone would like to say anything to welcome these returning members and new members to the board. Welcome, everyone. I look forward to talking with you more. Let's go on to the next slide. So we have just a few engagement highlights. First of all, in October at one of the prior meetings, MAPC staff was here to talk to the board and the public about the development of population, household, and employment forecast for 2050. And those are forecasts that support the long-range planning, development, and other activities that CTPS staff and the MPO also engage in. And at the time, at the meeting, MPC staff had said that they plan to send the draft municipal and sub-municipal allocations of the populations, households, and employment to municipalities for review in October. Note that it's now November, and so we just wanted to share with you all that due to some technical challenges, the time frame has been shifted to mid-November to share that information. So if you haven't seen it yet, that's the reason why, and please do keep an eye out to see that information in mid-November. We will share more details in conjunction with MPC, including new deadlines for the feedback that is being requested from municipalities as those details become available. And then in terms of upcoming events, we are continuing as, as MPO staff is continuing to meet with MPC at the sub-regional groups to discuss both the planning process for the MPO and the sub-region's transportation priorities to bring into our long-range planning work as well. And as always, please, I ask that board members, when we are holding meetings in your subregions, please do try to attend and spread the word and kind of take part in engaging the stakeholders that you represent. Stella Jordan is the contact for these events. She is our public engagement program manager, so please feel free to reach out to her if you have any questions. And the dates for the upcoming meetings are on the slide and also will be posted in the chat. But just to note that the next meetings for North Shore Task Force and the South Shore Coalition will be on November 10th, and for Three Rivers Interlocal Council will be on November 15th. And then we have another coffee chat coming up. We just hosted one a few days ago on the launch of the Berkshire Flyer Amtrak service between New York and Pittsfield. If you are interested in learning more about that and you couldn't attend, please always feel free to follow up with Sandy Johnston, as always. And then we have another coffee chat coming up later in this month on November 16th, focused on the development of Destination 2050, which is the MPO's long-range transportation plan and the updated coordinated plan. So registration for that will be in the chat as well. And then with that, the next slide just shows today's agenda items. They're also, of course, on the left in the agenda. So I'll just highlight that one of the main actions will be to elect a vice chair to the MPO board, which we do annually. And then we will have some action items for work scopes, notably the red-blue connector and something we're calling the sustainability and decarbonization in the freight and logistics sector in the North Suffolk area. And then we'll have two presentations of MPO work that has been completed, both developing baseline transportation equity indicators for the Boston region by Betsy Harvey, and then also a sub-regional priority roadway study presentation by Julie Dombrowski. And then as a reminder, the next meeting on the next slide will be at on November 17th, and we'll have two action items around endorsing amendments to the TIP and adjustment to the UPWP. And then we will also have four presentations. One of the highlights will be that we will begin to talk about the 2024 to 28 TIP universal projects. And then we will also talk about our study about access in the Blue Hills, integrating transit and truck priority, and the Route 1 priority corridor study in Norwood. And that, Mr. Chair, is all I have.
Thank you, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan? Seeing none, next item on the agenda is public comments. Mike Lambert.
Thank you, Chair. Here today to speak on the sub-regional priority roadway study, Washington Street corridor in Canton. Brockton Area Transit has a successful route that serves this area, so therefore we were part of the study. So two things. One, just wanted to offer my thanks to the MPO and CTPS for an excellent review of the area and some great findings. And then two, to highlight an issue that came up in our study that was sort of a very harmful issue that has a potential easy fix. And since that's a rare thing in transportation and government, wanted to highlight it for the benefit of the MPO and to the member communities, of course. And that was the when we're looking at the crash numbers along Cobb Corner in Canton Stoughton, We saw that a lot of it was driven by curb cut access to the strip malls along that area. And of course, in typical old New England fashion, these aren't even curb cuts. They're just sidewalks that are tilted down towards the street. So, one thing we found, one example we found was that there are 4 lanes serving a Dunkin' Donuts. So there's more roadway dedicated to accessing Dunkin' Donuts than there is to Washington Street itself. Another way to think about that is that there's more sidewalk area dedicated to cars than there is to pedestrians. So, I'm trying to encourage people to take the bus, and my bus stop is, surrounded by sort of 4 lanes of traffic that aren't even regulated. So these are, like I said, sort of non-signaled intersections that caused head-on collisions, but coming out of Cobb Corner Mall and coming out of the strip mall across the street and interacting with Washington Street. So just want to sort of put out there as an official public comment and encourage communities to take a look at the amount of space on their sidewalks and in their commercial areas dedicated to curb cuts or not even curb cuts. And just think about that as a potential easy fix that even if you didn't take away any space from the commercial entity and you just converted 2-way entrances and exits to 1-way and created a cycle of traffic that way, or if you could encourage your commercial partners to close down some of their entrances and exits, or at least minimize them, it would really makes a difference from a pedestrian point of view and from an encouraging transit point of view. So I just wanted to point that out. And certainly I think it makes sense as the MPO moves forward and engages in other projects like this, that they target that as just an easy potential fix in terms of their short-term recommendations as part of any study. But again, thank you very much for some good work.
Thank you, Mike. Any other comments from the public at this time? Steve Olenoff.
Hi, Steve Olenoff, Chick alternate. I wanted to talk more about the election we just had. If you participated in it at all, first of all, I want to congratulate everyone that's supposedly new on the MPO, but half of the subregions, if you didn't get a ballot, well, no one really got a ballot, but if you go online to vote, and you see that there are only ballots available for 4 of the 8 subregions. So 4 subregions didn't get, and the cities and towns within those 4 subregions didn't get to vote at all. And the 4 that did vote each had only 1 candidate. So there are 2 reasons for this. One was the way we originally set it up for the at-large. There are 4 at-large candidates, and it's a 3-year cycle. So we chose to go with the 2-2-1, 2-2-0 arrangements. So the 3rd year there would be no at-large candidates, and that 3rd year occurred here. So there are no at-large candidates this year. Rather than, we could have gone with as I suggested, a 2-1-1, so we at least have 1 at-large. And then the second reason this happened is last year we voted to change from everyone voting for the candidates in the subregions to only the subregion, the cities and towns within the subregion voting for that candidate for that subregion. So that means that they each get only 1 vote. So this year we got 4 subregions had no one to vote for, and 4 subregions who had just 1 candidate to vote for. So I think we should reconsider some of this, because that doesn't promote really good interest in elections. It doesn't promote, we're trying to increase participation, and I don't think that achieves that at all. So at a future meeting, I think we should discuss how to fix this.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Other comments at this time from the public? Seeing none, during the meeting, if you have a comment, please raise your hand and we will call on you. Committee chairs reports, are there any? Brian Kane.
Oh, I can unmute myself. Wow, sorry. I was waiting. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I should have known that, given that I was the one who suggested it. Thank you. Just to say, the Administration and Finance Committee met just before this meeting to continue its work on the operations plan. That work continues. We had a very good meeting today about board member roles and responsibilities as well as committees. And we will continue to discuss items such as elections, Steve. So please know that this is being worked on and we are not stuck in place for the sake of being stuck in place. We are always trying to broaden the participation of all the communities in the region. So next meeting is the 17th at 9 a.m. before this meeting. And all, of course, are invited. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions for Brian from the members? Seeing none, Derek Cravat.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say that the Unified Planning Work Program Committee will be meeting today at 1 p.m. to discuss an adjustment to the federal fiscal year 2023 UPWP. So after the committee votes on this today, it's planned to be presented to the full MPO for consideration and endorsement the next MPO meeting on November 17th. The adjustment deals mostly with changing some funding for the MAPC section of the UPWP, and the details can be found online on the meeting calendar through CTPS's website. So thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Next item on the agenda is the Regional Transportation Council Advisory Council report. Sorry, Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so we have not had a meeting since our last board meeting here, but to preview our meeting coming up on this Wednesday, it's coming Wednesday, we're going to have our highly respected former chair come to speak with us, being taken regarding an update on MPO peers changes. And we're also going to have Shalika Murthy come to talk with us about the UPWP and update, give us an update on it and also preview the process for study submissions. So very much looking forward to that. And I'm also apologizing in advance. I'm going to have to leave in around 11 o'clock because today's agenda is so exciting. So I'll follow up on it and certainly have members or presenters come and talk with the advisory council at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of September 15th. Can I get a motion in a second from the member, please? And state your name for the record when making a motion. Brian Kane.
The MBTA Advisory Board moves approval, Mr. Chair.
Eric Barassa.
I'll second that.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions? Seeing and hearing none. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
And Rowe, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Dana Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowitz, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tentakoulis,
Melissa, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the election of a vice chair for fiscal year 2023. Is there a motion for a nomination for a vice chair? Brian Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The MBTA Advisory Board is honored and proud to nominate the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC, for the position of Vice Chair of the Boston Regional Metropolitan Planning Organization Board. The Advisory Board, as a fellow regional entity for all of the communities region-wide, understands and embraces the work that MAPC does to bring communities together. Oftentimes, the borders of cities and towns the walls are very high for some people, and MAPC does a great job of trying to lower those barriers to bring us all together as citizens and as members of this region. And it is my great honor to enter MAPC name into nomination for the position of Vice Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Is there a second? Tom Bent.
I'd like to second.
Thank you. Any other nominations at this time? Seeing none, nominations are now officially closed. And Jonathan, please call the roll on MAPC's election for Vice Chair for the coming fiscal year.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Sarah Lee.
Sarah Lee, yes.
Do we? Yeah, I guess I do include Eric in this vote. I just want to be sure on that. So Eric Barassa,
Yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowitz, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tentaklis,
Melissa, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'd just like to congratulate MAPC and thank them for their willingness to serve. It's a pleasure to serve with you, Eric.
Thank you all. We really appreciate the opportunity to represent the region and be active in these conversations. And as always, if anybody has any issues, please come to me. I'm always excited to talk about things across the region. And thank you again.
Thank you, Eric. Next item on the agenda is the work scope for the Red Blue Connector, Ben Dowling.
Good morning. My name is Ben Dowling. I'm a transportation planner with CTPS. I work with the regional model on project applications work. I'm here this morning to talk about the work scope for the Red Blue Connector. CTPS has been asked by the MBTA to support a study for connecting the red line and the blue line at Charles MGH. The blue line under the proposal would be extended beneath Cambridge Street to Charles MGH. This work would be done in the context of a MEPA filing, and CTPS would use its regional travel demand model to perform this work. The MBTA is the client for this project. The budget is $213,000 over the course of 24 months. The bulk of the work that CTPS will do would be completed in about 9 months. There are 5 modeling scenarios envisioned for the project: a base year, an opening year no build and build scenario, and future year no build and build scenarios. The area that CTPS will focus on for this analysis is obviously the area where the 2 lines are proposed to be connected, but in particular would focus on Charles MGH on the red line, Bowdoin on the blue line, Park Street, where red and green intersect State Street, where the blue and orange intersect Downtown Crossing, and Government Center. CTPS will provide the project, the client and the project team with mode share information, station access information, transfer information, and boardings and lightings. CTPS would also perform an air quality and an environmental justice analysis in connection with this project, and will provide support to the project team for 2 public meetings. And CTPS would also document the analysis. CTPS does not anticipate that this work will interfere with MPO work. If you have any questions, I can do the best to answer them.
And Jay Monty has his hand raised. Jay Monty.
Yeah, this is kind of a more general question about the project shop. And Ben, it's okay if you can't answer this, and maybe somebody from the T or David, you can answer. I mean, obviously a lot of work has gone into the red blue connector in the past. There have been concept design, there's been, previous ridership studies. Can you just give some context regarding kind of how this relates to those? Is this starting from scratch? Is this building on those? Is this part of an application process that through, like I think I heard you say through MIPA, you're doing some MIPA work. So that's question 1. And question 2 is, this is really a critical project for the North Shore, and particularly for residents of Revere, even Everett, who may commute to, say, Charles MGH or want to transfer to the Red Line. So will your study look at that as well, and the ridership and transit mode shares that may be influenced from on the North Shore side?
Thanks for that question. I think I can respond to some of it, maybe not all of it. I believe that the last time that CTPS was involved in an analysis for this project was over 10 years ago. So it would warrant a fresh look. And to respond to the second half of your question, I'll leave the middle part to somebody else maybe. But we would also be looking at boardings and lightings or transit impacts or activity, not only in the locations that I mentioned, but in other areas as well. The study would focus on those areas, but activity on the blue line would also be captured in the study.
Okay, great. And Shannon Greenwell, who is the project manager for the MBTA, is with us today, and I think she can take a shot at answering the part of your question that Ben didn't answer. Shannon, just state your name for the record and then feel free to answer.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Shannon Greenwell, I'm the T project manager, and I'm with the Office of the Chief Engineer. And that is correct. We took the project through the DEIR process in 2010. Enough time has passed since that first filing that we do need to restart the environmental review process. We anticipate that it would be a notice of project change for MIPA. And that's why we're here requesting the modeling services so that we can get the analysis done to support the environmental review process. After 2010, there was another study done in 2018 that took a look at the tunneling construction methods as well as costs associated with those, and did some updates in terms of updating the populations in the areas that we're looking at, as well as the land use, just because there's been a lot of development that has taken place. In 2021, we completed a concept design report that did start to lay out some very conceptual and preliminary design, set out some design criteria. So we're certainly not starting from scratch, but we are restarting the environmental review process. And there is still a lot to work out in terms of the design decisions that we need to make to support both MIPA and NEPA filings. In terms of supporting communities in the North Shore, we'll certainly be making sure that our outreach is getting out to those blue line communities, not just the communities that would be impacted by the construction. And we will be looking at sort of the blue line ridership time savings and ridership derived from this new connection to the red line.
That's really great. Thanks, Shannon.
Thank
Brian?
you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to note that the MBTA Advisory Board and its member communities took a vote in April of 21 to fully support the construction and operation of the Red Blue Connector. This is something that we understand is incredibly important for communities, as Jay mentioned, on the North Shore, but also access for places like Somerville and Cambridge to get to Logan, to the Suffolk Downs construction site, the lab space that's being built out in Revere and beyond. And we also would support extending the Blue Line north to Lynn someday, but we're not there yet. And I guess, David, my question is similar to what Jay was asking. I remember attending a MEPA meeting 10 odd years ago where this was taken off of a list. So is this is no longer a legal requirement, I guess, is my question. And this is just the T doing this through its normal CIP process. Thank you.
Yes, this is no longer a SIP requirement. The design of the Red Blue Connector used to be a SIP requirement. It is no longer a SIP requirement. And this dates back to 2 or 3 years ago when the NCB took a vote to fund preliminary design for the Red Blue Connector, to fund the environmental review process for the Green Line extension to Medford, and to fund a study of Silver Line to Everett. And this is furthering, as Shannon said,
And just to follow up,
the box, and this is the next step.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And just to follow up, there's no scope in or decision-making in this study about who would pay for the construction and increased operating costs to the authority, is there?
That's correct, Mr. Kane. Currently, we have enough funding to take us through preliminary engineering to support environmental review. We will have an updated cost estimate associated with the project, which will include construction and capital costs as well as operating costs to support. But we do not have funding currently to go further into design, nor do we have funding at the moment for construction of the project.
Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm, certainly aware of this project from a kind of general sense. This is kind of a legacy project in a bit that's been wanting to be done for a while, but just sort of a general curiosity in terms of the constructability from Bowdoin to Charles MGH. Would there need to be new tunnels that are built underneath Cambridge Street? So would it be, I'm just trying to understand like how exactly that might be done just in a very general sense, and what I guess from a few years ago, what was the preliminary cost estimate for the project?
Sure. So under the concept design, we would be decommissioning Bowdoin Station to passengers and repurposing that space for things like ventilation and emergency egress. From Bowdoin, we would be constructing a new tunnel that would go under Cambridge Street and connect with a new Blue Line station underground up to the current head house and the Red Line station that's at Charles MGH. There was a cost estimate that was developed in 2021 as part of the concept design report, and that puts the cost at $850 million. That includes the construction costs as well as the additional rolling stock and more operational costs that would be associated with supporting that level of service.
Thank you.
Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that MGH is doing some major construction in that area. Do you know if there's been any coordination with them about the possibility of something happening there? Thank you.
Yes, that was one of the key components of the concept design report, is that we were, with the City of Boston's assistance, able to coordinate with Charles MGH and work with their design team. They will be saving space for a head house. There would be 2 entrances, one directly into the Red Line station at Charles MGH, another one, if you're going closer to where the Bowdoin station would be, that would connect directly into that new clinical building that they just broke ground on, I believe, in the last couple of weeks. There would be, I believe, retail use there. They would be using it for something else, but when if we were ready to construct the project, we would have space there, and we have that in their designs.
Thank you.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Yeah, Shannon well covered Len's question, just confirming that we were able to work well with MGH and obviously with MBTA to make sure that they were accommodating a future station footprint. So, and obviously just on the the project as a whole. Obviously, the city is strongly supportive of the project, and glad to see that this important work is moving forward, and looking forward to working with Ben and Shannon as needed at the city, and progressing the permitting and this analysis. So thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve this as presented? Jim Fitzgerald, you've got your hand up anyway, so go ahead.
Yeah, make a motion to approve, I think is what I'm doing right.
Thank you. Brian Kane.
MBTA Advisory Board seconds that motion.
Motion having been made and seconded, please call the roll.
My mistake, David Moeller,
Yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Eric Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Ben,
Tom Bennett, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowitz, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tentakoulis, I will come back. Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Tom O'Rourke,
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Melissa Tentakoulis.
Guys, I'm having some audio trouble.
We hear you now. If you want to put your vote in the chat, I can read it out loud.
Time to move on.
Yes, sir. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair. We are approved.
Thank you. And if Melissa puts her vote in the chat, we will, of course.
How is that? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, there you go. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Melissa. Next item on the agenda is a work scope for sustainability and decarbonization in the freight and logistics sector in the North Suffolk area. Sandy Johnston.
All right. Good morning, Mr. Chair, and thank you. So I am here today to present the work scope for the federal fiscal year 2023 UPWP study titled, as you just said, Sustainability and Decarbonization in the Freight and Logistics Sector in the North Suffolk area. And I do apologize for the excessively long name of the study. It is work program number 13808. This work scope is for a total budget of $67,500, although as you will hear shortly, that number does not in fact capture the total amount that we are proposing to spend on this study. There are two items posted on the meeting calendar to accompany this presentation. First is the CTPS work scope for this study, containing a written description of the work, a schedule, and a program budget. It is accompanied by a supplement from MAPC detailing their budgetary commitment to the study, which totals $37,850 coming out of MAPC's own UPWP funds. So first, I want to talk a bit about the study because it's a little bit different from things we've done before. The basic idea is to develop data on and take a look at decarbonizing and cleaning up air pollution from the freight and logistics sector in a slice of the MPO region: Chelsea, part of Everett, Revere, Winthrop, and East Boston. All of those relevant municipalities have signed off to support the study, and we are calling it the North Suffolk area, although it was pointed out to me after we came up with the name that Everett is in fact in Middlesex County. The concept for this study was originally brought to MAPC by the City of Chelsea and the North Suffolk Office of Resiliency and Sustainability that is housed there in Chelsea. MAPC staff decided to share it with us at CTPS as the UPWP study concept. And together we evolved it a little bit to be more regional, and the UPWP committee elected to fund it in the fiscal year 23 UPWP. The core idea of the study is that this area that we're talking about is home to heavy concentrations of environmental justice populations, while also being a key industrial and logistical node for the entire region due to the presence of Logan Airport, port and railroad facilities, produce market, highways, and such. The local municipalities would like to retain the industrial and logistics jobs brought by that cluster, which are under significant pressure from high land values. See a soon-to-be-released MEPC study for more on that, but would also like to relieve some of the environmental justice burdens on the local population linked to the presence of such economic activities. Ideally, this study will be the first phase of work in this area, and in the future, we'll be able to work with these municipalities to pursue additional work, including potentially by looking for alternative funding sources. We also think that this study could be an interesting model for future work around the MPO region, looking at other geographic areas. So we plan for this study to proceed through a number of stages over the next 11 months, wrapping up by the end of federal fiscal year 2023, the end of September. In task 1, we will collect basic data on the study area, freight infrastructure, environmental justice populations, and land use relating to industrial and logistics sectors. In task 2, which runs concurrently with task 1, we will conduct a literature review to help us better understand the issues at hand and how other metropolitan areas have dealt with them or plan to handle them. Having collected that baseline information, in task 3, we'll work with the CTPS communications and engagement team and equivalent staff at MEPC to consult extensively with key stakeholders, the local governments who are supporting the study, local businesses, including shippers and freight carriers, and activists and advocates in these communities. Tasks 4 and 5 will conduct more advanced research, both qualitative and quantitative, with the details of that research being directed by the combination of previous findings and consultation with stakeholders. Task 6 covers development of recommendations and production of the final work product, which we plan to be a story map. We think that's a suitable type of work product for capturing the large amount of data we plan to collect and analyze as part of this work. We'll pay special attention to make sure that the final product is accessible to residents of the area that we're working in, especially in terms of languages that people speak. So just a note about budgeting for the study. As I said above, the budget for the study from the CTPS side is $67,500, supplemented by $37,850 from MEPC, for a total of $105,350. That doesn't fully capture the time that all MPO staff will spend on the study. We're budgeting a little bit differently this year, and the time for CTPS work groups, such as communications and engagement, editorial, and graphics, is budgeted separately from study or program budget. So those groups will all be involved in this study, especially communications and engagement, but their time is not actually captured in that budget. It comes kind of off on top of the scope that we're presenting here. At this point, I'm happy to take your questions about this work scope and the study. I believe at least one of my colleagues, Travis Pollock and Allison Felix from MEPC, who have been close collaborators through the scope development process and will be leading the MEPC side of the study, are here as well to answer any questions. Once you're satisfied, we ask for your vote to approve this work scope so that we can get started on the work.
Thank you, Sandy. Before I call on members, taken, I have a question. The non-budgeted communications and other work, is that overhead?
No, it is absolutely not overhead. It is actually budgeted for separately in the UPWP. So it's a way we are sort of adjusting how we are accounting for staff work, but it is all UPWP associated budget. And feel free, other staff, if there's any reason you feel like you want to chime in on that.
All right, I'll talk to you more about that offline later sometime.
Sure.
Lynn Diggins?
Yeah, well, actually, thank you, Mr. Chair, because you were kind of getting at what I was thinking about too, and I was trying to remember when we were putting together or selecting studies, because I remember this was a fairly high cost study. I think this is great. I think it's really, really good. And I think the communication aspect of it is wonderful, because I think it will allow us to do the kind of relationship building that we need for what we're aiming for from doing this kind of a study. So I was interested in knowing what the full cost of it was, because that'll help us gauge how to select studies, I mean, in the next UPWP cycle, but I think you're gonna have conversations with David offline about that, and I imagine the information will get to us, so if you don't have it now, that's fine. And I'll just say, Sandy, you will now have to add "and Middlesex County" to the title, and that's gonna make it even longer. So thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Similar to Lynn, just wanted to express my full support for this. Sandy, I'm shocked that you're working on a freight issue. I never would have imagined that in a million years. I hope that when this is done, you will have paid, and I'm sure you will, some attention to incredibly important projects like the Silver Line extension, which is sorely missing in the bus network redesign, but is incredibly important to the decarbonization efforts of this area. And also just wanted to suggest that some attention be paid, at least as a thought process, whether through this or through other work, to where light industrial displaced entities will go. We cannot have an economy based solely on banks and things like that. We do need light industry, especially the jobs they create. And especially if we can decarbonize them. So as was mentioned, as land values increase in this part of the region, we're going to have to think broadly about where those industries and the jobs that come with them will go. And I just want to make sure that that is considered, and I know that you will certainly do so. And if we could get some freight rail catenary, I know you like me would love to think about that, Sandy. So thank you.
General.
Yes, thank you. So this looks like a really fantastic scope of work. I'm excited to see it get underway and the results. I was kind of echoing earlier comments, really excited to see the robust stakeholder consultation that's built into it. And I think the idea of presenting the results in the story map makes a ton of sense. The one suggestion I'd have is just making sure that there's, I noticed, as is typical, like a presentation of the work products to the MPO. And I'm wondering, given the amount of stakeholder input into this, if there's ways of making sure that all of the results get presented back to the folks who contributed, which I'm sure is already part of the thought process, but wanted to elevate that. So thank you so much.
Sandy?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm, even if we didn't capture that explicitly in the scope, we absolutely intend to do so.
Thank you. Any other MPO member comments before I open it up to the public? Seeing none, someone whose name is only listed as Ask Wayne, please state your name for the record and your affiliation if you have one.
Hi, sorry, I accepted the abbreviation of my name. It's Abby Swain from US EPA, Region 1. Yeah, and I was just going to put this in chat because I have a link, but and I'm pretty sure this has occurred to you, but this sounds like an ideal project to get some funding for in future stages from the Federal Highway Carbon Reduction Program formula funding that MassDOT has already begun receiving and will receive more of in coming years. So just wanted to put in the plug for that source of funding, which calls explicitly for planning and projects to reduce emissions from freight. And of course, from EPA Region 1's point of view, with our emphasis on air quality and environmental justice and clean freight, this sounds like a real winner.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve the work scope as presented today? Lynn Diggins.
I make a motion to approve the work scope.
Eric Barassa.
I'll second that motion.
Motion has been made and seconded. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moller,
Yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Zaganowitz, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tentakoulis,
Melissa, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is a presentation on developing baseline transportation equity indicators for the Boston region. Betsy Harvey.
Great, thanks, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. My name is Betsy Harvey. I run the Transportation Equity Program for the Boston region, and I'm going to talk today about the results for 2022 UPWP study identifying transportation inequities in the Boston region. A link to the report can be found on the MPO website, as well as links to the study's data repository that's on GitHub and the interactive online application. If we could maybe get those links in the chat too, that would be really helpful. This study came out of the public engagement process that we undertook between 2018 and 2020 to create a disparate impact and disproportionate burden policy, or DIDB policy, for the long-range transportation plan. And many of the stakeholders that were involved in that wanted us to go above and beyond what is required for our DIDB analysis and address existing transportation inequities. And that really prompted us to think about how we might do that. And this study is an important step in helping the MPO take on that role. Could I get control of the screen, please? Thank you. So our study had 4 goals. The first was to develop an initial set of baseline equity indicator metrics that reflect existing conditions for minority populations, low-income populations, and households without access to vehicles. A second goal was to create and document a replicable method that we could use as a basis for future work, and also to lay the groundwork for expanding the metric set to include additional metrics going forward. And then finally, to provide a baseline for our DIDB metrics for our long-range plan. If you compare the metrics that we use to analyze disparate impacts in the last long-range plan, you'll see that there is some similarities to those used in this study, and that was very much on purpose. We analyzed 2 types of metrics in this study: destination access metrics and travel cost metrics. We focused on those because we heard from the MPO board, as well as from stakeholders, that these were of interest. And as I mentioned, they coincide with some of those in the DIDB analysis. We also recently acquired a new destination access tool called Conveil, which allows us to run destination access analyses much more easily and quickly than we've been able to do in the past. We conducted public engagement during the early and middle stages of the study to get feedback on the sorts of metrics that we might want to analyze, as well as feedback on the sorts of products that we might produce that would be most helpful for stakeholders when they look at the results of our study. We spoke to stakeholders representing a range of community types and organizational interests in the region, including organizations with a strong environmental justice focus. One thing we always asked during these conversations was how we could best produce or present the results in a way that would be most useful to the widest range of stakeholders. In response, we've developed several work products that meet the needs of different audiences. In addition to a traditional report, we have developed an online application that people can use to explore the study results, as well as a data repository that anyone can access to dive deep into our methodology and repeat the analyses if they'd like to. We hope that this will facilitate multiple tangible and meaningful ways for people to engage with the data. Now, in addition, we do plan on a series of follow-up engagement activities to reconnect with the original stakeholders as well as other interested parties. And that will be a really good opportunity to strengthen those stakeholder relationships and get more folks engaged with this work as we move forward to expand it in our transportation equity program. So let's look at destination access first. I'll give a kind of a brief primer because I don't think this is something we've really engaged with substantially at the MPO. So they're basically, it basically measures the ability of people to reach a destination. And there are really 4 pieces of information that you need in order to measure destination access. One is, where do people live? Because we measure access from people's homes. For example, in our analysis, we look at access from people's home census tracts to various destinations throughout the region. We also need a travel mode that people use to make the trip, such as public transit. We need to set a travel time threshold within which people have to make the trip. So for example, we will say a destination is accessible if they can reach it within 45 minutes. And finally, we need a destination, and that can be really anything. It can be points such as jobs. It can be kind of an area like a park, or it can be kind of a line on, like you might find a line on the map, like a roadway or a shared use path or the like. What is destination access not? It does not look at accessibility from the standpoint of people with disabilities. It is a measure of potential. It does not consider whether people want to access the destination or other factors that affect the likelihood of someone making that trip, like transit fares or cost or tolls. It's just, could they make that trip with the transportation network that exists today? So in our study, our results are reported in 2 ways. The first is the total number of destinations that are accessible to each population group. And the second is the number of destinations that are accessible per person for the population group. And this second one is really our measure of equity. Per person, is access to destination equitable between 2 different population groups? And I'll kind of keep harping back on this because this is a really important point of how we did the analysis. So let's look at the specific metrics that we analyzed access to. We looked at 8 different destinations, which are on the screen, as well as 2 different transportation modes for each metric, either driving and public transit or walking and biking. The ones that we analyzed access by driving and public transit include access to jobs, higher education, emergency healthcare, non-emergency healthcare, and access to large parks. And large parks are those that are over 124 acres. The metrics that we looked at for access to walking by walking and bicycling are access to essential places, all parks, and off-street paths. So to determine whether access was inequitable or not, we compared access per person between the equity population and their respective non-equity population. So between a minority population and non-minority population, between low-income population and non-low-income population, between households without a vehicle and households that have access to one. And when we find, say, that the low-income population has access to fewer jobs than the non-low-income population, we say that there's an equity flag. And that, again, that's a term that I'll be using kind of as a shortened way of indicating that there is less access for the equity population. I want to talk for a minute now about the 3 different equity population groups for which we analyzed access: the minority population, low income population, and zero vehicle households. We used data that you'll see shown on the maps of the next 3 slides to estimate where people live, because trips originate from where people live. I point this out because destination access is partly a function of where people live, as well as the transportation network and where destinations are located. So it can be really tricky to pull apart what is a function of where people live, as well as and then what's a function of the transportation network. But this really underlines a critical way in which we should be thinking about transportation investments and policies, particularly as it relates to underserved and overburdened populations in our region. The transportation and land use are really linked, and it's difficult to address inequities without also understanding housing and land use policies and how they interact with the transportation network to produce the transportation outcomes we see. And we'll come back to this point later in the presentation. So if we look at the minority population, we can see in the darker areas, blue areas is where there are more higher share of communities of color. Orange circles kind of highlight that. We have areas in Lynn, Everett, Boston, Randolph, Ashland, Milford. But people of color, of course, live throughout all of the entire region. We can also look at the same analysis for the low-income population. You can see a pattern where people, again, folks are living, lower income folks living throughout our region, from Boston to Weymouth to Gloucester, Acton, Marlborough, Milford, Burlington. And finally, we can look at the same thing for zero vehicle households. What we expect to see is kind of what we do see is that folks without access to cars tend to live where there's better public transit. But again, not just Boston and inner core, but also folks do live without access to cars in other areas of our region as well. So in addition to analyzing access across the entire MPO region, we also analyzed access within subregional areas. Now, these are not our official subregions. These are community types that were developed by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and they're based on population density and land use. So by analyzing access to community types or within community types, we're able to control for these factors and look at access among towns with similar characteristics. We're able to control for that density of population. There are 8 community types in our MPO region. From the most dense to least dense, they are metropolitan core communities, streetcar suburbs, subregional urban centers, mature suburbs, established suburbs, maturing New England towns, and country suburbs. And since community types were developed for the entire state, there are 2 types that Boston do not have: the faded out text on the screen, major regional urban centers, and rural towns. So to give you a sense what this kind of analysis looks like, this is an example of a destination access analysis map that we did for metropolitan core communities. And you can see just those areas have kind of that access shown in those communities. The darker the purple area shows that there's access to more jobs for folks living there. And we'll see that these maps are available in our online application, which we'll see in just a minute. So that's the destination access. The transportation cost metrics. These are really exploratory in nature, which is why we kind of had to look at them in 3 different ways. There isn't kind of one standard that we found that really shows fully how transportation cost varies across our region and between communities. So we wanted to kind of explore what's out there and ways that we might best kind of demonstrate those cost challenges. We did look at household transportation expenditures, which you may be familiar with from the Department of Labor. These results you'll find in the report. I'm not going to touch on them here because they're much more straightforward. And I want to focus instead on the 2 other metrics that we looked at: the Housing and Transportation Index and the Value of Travel Time Analysis. The Housing and Transportation Index, or H&T Index, is from the Center for Neighborhood Technology. It simply combines housing and transportation costs and interprets them as a percent of household income. And because housing and transportation are fairly fixed costs in household budgets, it can be very useful to look at them together. Now, the value of travel time analysis is a little bit wonky, so kind of stay with me as I try to talk through what it does. It essentially converts travel time to a monetary value. So it converts the amount of time you spend traveling to a cost based on the region's prevailing wage rate. What this does is allows us to standardize and compare the utility and quality of travel by different modes. Now, the value of travel time is based on the perceived value of time. And that means people's perception of how long a trip takes, as that's how we experience time, and it's a major factor in our decision on which transportation mode we might take. The perceived value of time takes into account not just the clock time of the trip, like half an hour, but also the trip quality, like comfort, congestion, and number of transfers you might make. Because a transfer always makes a trip feel longer, Congestion on a roadway always makes the trip feel longer. So this analysis helps us to answer questions such as, how realistic of an option is transit trip versus driving trip? How attractive is public transit as a travel mode? And how well does public transit serve different areas in our region compared to driving? So whereas destination access analyses really looks at the quantity of things we can get to, the value of travel time analysis looks at the quality of that trip and therefore the utility and attractiveness of making it. So I just want to kind of ground you a little bit more in what that actually kind of looks like. This is an example of that calculation from Quincy to the Longwood Medical area. Using public transit, we have trip segments such as waiting at a stop or in-vehicle travel time, a time in minutes, and then the percent of the wage rate for that trip segment. And then finally, the value of that trip segment based on the travel time and that percentage of the wage rate, which is applied to that $29.13. That's the average hourly wage rate. Those wage rates we got from the Victoria Transport Policy Institute. We didn't do our own effort to calculate to determine how much what percent of the wage rate is each trip segment. That's something that Victoria Transport Policy did a lot of research on, and we pulled their data, their estimate on how we value time, and applied it to our own work. So I'm going to switch now to our online applications. We can really dive a little bit more in depth to see kind of those results. Just give me a second to navigate. Okay, so what we're seeing here is our online application for both our destination access and travel cost metrics. The tab on the far right, and please feel free to follow along if you'd like in the app. There's information about the study, but I'm going to focus on these three tabs to the left. So our first tab is the destination access tab, which contains all of our maps. And it shows which areas have greater access or access to more opportunities. For example, we can navigate to access to parks, and it will show you within a 15-minute walk and bicycle for everybody living in our region, which areas have access to more parks. We can also choose just access by walking, and we can filter that by equity population. And so we're going to see access for the minority population and non-minority population by a 15-minute walk in the entire region. And then we can further filter that by our community types. We can see just the communities in the metro poor communities, and we can see how much access areas, the communities within that community type has. So these, again, remember, these are the total number of destinations. And I apologize, you cannot zoom in. These are raster data sets and will get very grainy if you were to zoom in. But hopefully it gives you kind of a bigger picture overview regionally and within our different community types as to the amount of opportunities different population groups can access. The second tab is called the Compare Access tab. And there's a lot of information in this tab, so I'm going to try to point you to kind of the areas that are most useful and to help you kind of pick out what you should be focusing on. The tab that we're really interested in is this equity check, or sorry, the column we're most interested in is equity check ratio. And that's going to tell you if there's an equity flag and how many of those for a particular destination and equity population group. Remember, equity checks, or sorry, our equity flags are when there is an inequity in access. So let's look at non-emergency, let's look at emergency healthcare. And again, we can choose our metro core communities, and we see the results for drive trips and for transit trips. And if we look at the equity flags, when you see this kind of red, see the text in red, that indicates that the equity population, in this case, the minority population, has access to fewer hospitals than the non-minority population. That's kind of the quick and dirty way of just seeing, okay, this is potentially an issue we need to kind of look at and focus on. This is really kind of our first step. It's also important to look at the difference between different population groups, right? And what do we consider a consequential inequity? Is access to 25 hospitals significantly worse than access to 26 hospitals on average? Is that a meaningful difference? And that might vary by metric. We might say, okay, 25 hospitals is like a lot of hospitals, but we want everybody to be able to access more parks. The more parks you can get to, the better. So that's something, kind of another layer that the MPO and others might kind of think about when we're looking at access. So we're not proposing answers right now. This is really kind of a starting point, but we can help us start thinking about and prioritizing interventions. So the final tab we're going to look at is the travel cost tab, and that is home to our housing and transportation cost index and our value of travel time. We'll start with the housing and transportation index. So in the drop-down menu, you can choose from a variety of different metrics to look at. We're going to start with the transportation cost as a % of income. And it kind of shows you what you might expect to see. The lighter areas, the yellow and green areas, mean that there is less, people spend less on transportation than the dark blue areas. So in Boston, surrounding suburbs, transportation is cheap. People don't spend as much on transportation. In the suburbs, people tend to spend a lot more on transportation as a % of their income. If we combine transportation then with housing costs, we see a little bit of a different story. You see pockets of lower costs in areas like Framingham, in the urban core, again, some of the North Shore and South Shore. But the highest cost areas are really kind of just west of Boston, where people are spending a lot on both housing and transportation. So what does this have to do with equity? We didn't have the time to really overlay these data with low income and other population groups. But what we do know is that poverty has really decreased in our region since 2010, and that while that is the case, decrease has mostly taken place in urban areas. So poverty has really gone down in urban areas in our region, but not as much in some of the more suburban areas, which means is that we found is that poverty is in the suburbs, and that's something that is important for us to think about. And we found that when we analyze access to destinations, that low income families tend to have a lot more inequities of access compared to wealthier households. And in fact, income is more strongly associated with destination access and equities than other demographics we looked at. So finally, we'll look at the value of travel time analysis. We were able to use Conveyo, our destination access tool, to break down each segment of a trip into its component travel times, as I explained earlier. And we will use this capability to determine the value of travel time for driving and transit trips, and converted that to a monetary value of time for that trip. Again, using those travel time factors from the Victoria Transport Policy Institute. So if we hover over a census tract, what we'll see is the cost delta, the difference in value in travel time between a drive trip and a transit trip. Remember, this is the perceived value of time, so it's quality of life factors, clock time, but not the cost of tolls and fares. And in every case, we find that drive trips have a lower value of time than public transit trips. In other words, it takes longer and is less convenient and is less comfortable to be taking public transit in every census tract that we were able to get data for. So to look at how these differences vary throughout the region, we selected 5 destinations. You can select any destination from our dropdown. We're gonna pick Framingham in this case. We limited access within 45 minutes to trips that could be taken within walking distance of that tract centroid, with a maximum of 3 public transit trip transfers. So what this shows is access from all tracks in the Boston region to Framingham here by both public transit trips and drive trips. And I want to draw your attention to two color patterns on the map. The first is these areas in yellow and green. Again, that yellow and green color indicates that the value of travel time and public transit trip and driving are much closer, they're much more equitable. These darker blue areas indicate that driving is much kind of cheaper when we're talking about kind of that value of time. In other words, transit from those census tracts, those dark blue areas, is far more time consuming and inconvenient than in those yellow areas. And so when one is trying to get to Framingham by public transit, it's easier in places like Natick and Wellesley and Boston, but other places like Marlborough, even though it's really close by, it's much more difficult to get to. The second thing, which you're probably thinking, is why all the gray areas? And I think that's actually a really important point to this analysis, because what that shows is that there is no data. There is no public transit trip available from these census tracts in these gray areas to Framingham. So access is very limited to kind of the Worcester Rail Line and the connecting bus and rapid transit network, as well as the MWRTA bus services that serve the Metro West communities. And even communities like Sherborne and Sudbury that border Framingham really have no realistic transit access to Framingham. So with that, I'm going to go back to my presentation. If you wouldn't mind putting it back up, Logan. Thank you. Could you give, perfect. And talk about some of the high-level takeaways that we found in this study. We'll start with the destination access. So this chart shows the number of equity flags by metric. In other words, the number of times that we found that the equity population had access to fewer destinations per person. We found that access to parks has the most inequities across all travel modes and demographic groups that we analyzed, with 16 total equity flags. The next two were emergency healthcare with 14 and large parks with 13 equity flags. If we look at equity flags also by demographic, what we see, as I mentioned earlier, is that that income is most strongly associated with inequitable access, more than minority population status or household access or vehicle access. Low income population we found had 43 equity flags, which is 34% of the total number they could possibly have in our analysis. And finally, we found that region-wide, there are no inequities to any of the destinations we looked at, but when we broke it out by community type, we found that inequitable access was present in all of our community types. Interestingly, except streetcar suburbs, as you see at the bottom of the screen, streetcar suburbs, we actually found no inequitable access for any of our destinations. Doesn't mean they're perfect. It just is some, the metrics that we looked at that happened to be the case. We found that just because a community has a high population density, it does and overall good transit access, such as in metro core communities, that does not always mean equitable access. And this was a very interesting and kind of surprising finding that we found. The metro core communities that have the best transit access actually had the most equity flags, 22. And the least dense communities, the country suburbs, had the second most with 21. What we think is happening is that within the metro core, public transit services tend to serve better, wealthier and wider communities than poorer families and communities of color when it comes to accessing those destinations that we looked at. This is probably partly a destination or partly a result of where people can or can afford to choose to live, as well as a result of the choices behind certain transportation investments and planning. So when it comes to transportation costs, some of our takeaways include that we found that housing and transportation costs tend to be highest in the inner suburban ring, just outside of the inner core. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the share of equity populations, particularly lower income families, has been increasing in the outer suburbs. And the comparison of 2010 and 2020 census data, we found that while poverty has decreased in the Boston region, it has decreased much slower in our suburban and rural areas. In urban areas, it's decreased about 7.5%, while in the suburban rural areas, it's decreased by about 4%. And finally, in all cases, transit trips cost more than driving trips when we take into account the value of travel time based on trip quality and clock time. And so despite significant congestion in our Boston region, the opportunity cost of making transit trips is higher than driving. By providing a standardized metric for comparing travel modes, we're able to see that the travel time burden that many people of color, low-income communities, and people without access to cars bear when they do rely on public transit, that is significantly less efficient than driving, and during lengthy trips, even though they are less able to afford to do so oftentimes. So I want to wrap up to kind of talk a little bit about our where we want to go from here, knowing that this was a first pass at this sort of work as an agency, and we want to keep it going. The study really represents an ending, represents not an ending, but rather a place for the MPO to build upon to better understand inequities in our region and what we can do about it. We plan on further conversations with stakeholders about our findings, and ultimately we hope that these analyses will be used as tools to advance our practices, policies, and investments that improve transportation outcomes for environmental justice and other underserved and overburdened populations and communities. Our intention in the coming years to ensure that the study continues to live on in the Transportation Equity Program. We plan to add new metrics and explore how we might track how inequities change over time and provide that information to your board and to our stakeholders and to the public so that it can be used to better inform our investments and policies and improve outcomes for these communities. I also just want to flag a complementary study that our public engagement team will be presenting on next week or next meeting, addressing equity and access in the Blue Hills. The findings for both this study and that one are really complementary. You'll see that both do look at access, and that access to Blue Hills study looks specifically at access to parks. And hopefully you'll find kind of these two studies kind of complementary and think about how they interact and what we can take away from the different perspectives that they both bring. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions or feedback. And I just want to say that our data analyst on this project, Emily DeMonico, who did a brilliant job building the app and the GitHub page, is here as well to answer any kind of really detailed analysis questions. So looking forward to the conversations. Thank you.
Brian Kane.
Thank you, David. Betsy, that's a ton of work. Thank you for all of that. And fascinating. And I'm glad to hear it's the start, not the end. I guess with respect to transportation costs and calculating it, I guess I just want to make sure that going forward or perhaps in this study that I didn't see it, the total cost of car ownership is included in the calculation. And that includes depreciation, which is often forgotten. And I think just, to make sure that's included to show that the cost to drive is not free, even on non-tolled roads, and also not counting gas prices. There is a cost. And I guess I would also sort of ask going forward, when you're doing your individual segment analyses to when calculating the transportation cost, perhaps consider some kind of a discount for shared vehicle trips or an additional cost for single occupancy vehicle trips to account for the cost to the climate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lindsay?
You can unmute yourself now, Lindsay.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Awesome. Really excited about this study. Thank you all very much. Lindsay Heffernan from the MBTA. And I have a question maybe similar to Brian's, but on a different frame. When you're thinking about affordability, particularly for the MBTA, the mode really matters, both time and cost of travel out of pocket cost. And so when you were doing your analyses, were you looking, Betsy, at sort of the cheapest or the time bound? So the Framingham example, right? They could take the commuter rail, you could take the bus, or I was looking at Longwood and thinking about North Shore. There were some numbers that surprised me if you were maybe using bus. They don't surprise me if you were taking commuter rail, but obviously there's a trade-off there of time. So can you talk about how you teased out, or what method you used to figure that out? And I can't wait to think about more, and I will probably follow up with an email. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Lindsay. I believe it was mode agnostic. I don't know, Emily, if you remember if the conveyor routed how they chose the transit trip mode.
Sure. So that analysis is really focusing on the amount of time that it took to make different trips. So it's whether the trip could happen and then the average time associated with all possible trip paths. So because we're not able to cleanly account for other car related costs, we also didn't account for transit fare costs in that analysis, and we focused on the comparison of time between the two different drive and transit modes. So all transit was considered as one unit there. With future work, we could be more sophisticated about pricing travel and incorporate that into this, but we wanted to focus more on that mode to mode comparison to focus on drive quality versus transit quality.
Eric Barassa.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this work. This is phenomenal, and I'm really excited to kind of dig into this. And I really appreciate that not only do you have this report, but you have this tool that I think can be very helpful in lots of different planning processes. I'm trying to think about how we can incorporate this work into more of the things that we do. That point that both Brian and I think Lindsay have touched on, that the looking at that travel time cost is really just time. That doesn't even include like what would a commuter rail, so if you think about a low income person from Framingham, driving to Boston versus taking the commuter rail. So that's another layer to even explore further on top of it, because as we've had conversations with Lindsay, like for a low income person, the commuter rail, just the higher cost of it can be such a barrier, which is such an argument for creating some type of low income fare program. But the question I have is just very simple. For the online tool, when you look at I guess most of it is municipality, some of it is census tract. Is that access for all the people trying to get to destinations in that area, or is it for people living in that municipality trying to get to destinations that are spread across the region?
The latter. So it starts, it looks at where people are living, and you look at what the census tract they live in. Well, it's actually a grid. It's a grid because it's a raster analysis, but basically it's where people are living, and then where can they get to on the transportation network from that location to the any destination in the region.
So when you're looking at the maps and there's darker purple, it's indicating that the people who are living in that geography have access to more things.
Right, exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
Jen Rowe.
Great, thank you. So first, just I want to say really great presentation and fantastic analysis. It's really cool getting to see how the initial work we did on DIDV many years ago has kind of led into all of this. And so I guess just gratitude to you for working on it, for the feds for getting this kind of moving on in this line of analysis, and the MPO for supporting it. I have kind of one comment to kind of add on to those others that were said earlier, and then a couple questions. The first, in terms of the accounting for time, I'm curious, down the road if there might be a way to incorporate issues of reliability into that time calculation, because and this kind of goes to the aspect of modes and transit, where certain modes are, I imagine people taking a bus with multiple transfers have to budget in a much higher amount of time, even if on average their trip might be, not as long as another trip, but just having to account for that higher variability. The question, I was curious about how you made the decisions on which destinations to use drive and transit versus walking and biking. And I'm curious if that's a technical limitation or something you may be able to add in the future. And I'd personally advocate, especially in some of the communities who are trying to really encourage active commuting to places like jobs, that be analyzed as well. And then the final very kind of question is an encouragement and question about whether there might be ways to download this data in shapefile form, so we can zoom in quite a bit closer, because I was really wanting to, and I understand that those are rasters. So thank you.
Sure. So reliability, we did include impedances on the roadway network, so congestion, and I think it was 2018, 2019 levels. So there is ability and conveyor to kind of add additional kind of types of impedances. We just have to kind of get that data. In terms of selecting the metrics, the travel mode, it was really kind of a practical thing. We didn't want to have every single mode for every single metric. Presenting that amount of data, it just felt really impractical. And so we focused on kind of what we felt were the more common types of travel modes for people to access certain metrics, access to parks, like they're local. We feel like most people, you want to be able to walk to your neighborhood park and have that easy access. Whereas we might be more willing to drive to a hospital, but definitely you easily can add different modes if that's something that we think that is really important in the future to do. That's not a difficult thing. And then for your third question, I'll defer to Emily. I don't know if you can download those data into shapefiles.
Sure. So as for other mode time combinations, we did run 15, 20, 30, 60, 45 and 60 minutes, I believe, maybe not the 20, for all modes on all destinations. And those are downloadable ratios in the GitHub repository. So if you wanted to investigate 45-minute bike trips, we have that already calculated in there. And then for the data, it's hard to download a shapefile, but it is in there. They're currently kind of stored as a TIFF input, and then there is a stars, which is the R raster format storage. Something that I really want to build into this is like a download option, so that when you're looking at a map, you can download it and start to do stuff with it. But I think we have to figure out how to facilitate that. But for now, everything is downloadable on the GitHub site. And if you have specific things that you want to look at and delve in deeper, you could facilitate that on a more request basis.
Laura Gilmore.
Yeah, I just, following up on what Lindsay said, I also just wanted to say thank you for this report. It was a really interesting report to read. And in particular, I find the conclusions about the shifting geography to be really interesting from a planning perspective, and ones that, I am interested to continue the conversation about, what that means, and how we all, work with the reality of a shifting populations of low-income residents, and their access to transit. I am also just interested in following up on the comments that several other people have made about where this analysis might go from here. I think it's really helpful that you have these study to action recommendations. But I am just curious, given you've gotten feedback from a number of people here about, some other facets that might be worth considering, is there what is the opportunity to, continue this work and to, potentially incorporate some of those other factors like the cost of travel by different modes and reliability into this work.
That's a really good question, Laura. I appreciate that. That's something I was thinking a lot about last couple of months, and have incorporated. It's not obvious in the UPWP, but in the equity program, we are allocating a significant portion of the budget to continuing this work and expanding the number of metrics that we look at. What those metrics will be, more besides access, destination access. I wanted to see what feedback I got from you all. So this is certainly very, very useful. And we'll continue to do stakeholder engagement, as I mentioned, around the outcomes of this study to get further feedback on where we should be going. And it seems like folks have a really strong interest in continuing to refine and improve our cost analyses. So that certainly will be an area that we kind of pursue, and we do have the funding for that. And would, I think I would like to have this, these baseline metrics be useful for the MPO in decision making. And so we can continue to have that conversation, throughout the year as we continue with our work and kind of refine and think about how can we best present these results in a way, in a format that is useful for folks and that can be maintained and updated on a regular basis and can feed into some of the planning processes that the MPO makes. So definitely stay tuned, and we will not let this fall by the wayside.
Other comments or questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Emily. Next presentation is Sub-Regional Priority Roadway Study, Washington Street Corridor in Canton. Julie Dombrowski.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. I am Julie Dombrowski. I'm a transportation planner in the Traffic Analysis and Design Group at CTPS. Logan, do you think I could have access to the screen? But this study is part of it's a sub-regional priority roadway study, which is funded under the UPWP. And this specific corridor was identified via our outreach to our MPO subregions. So our study area, our study area runs along Washington Street in the town of Canton from Sherman Street on the northernmost end down to Route 27 near the Cobb Corner Shopping Plaza. So before we started collecting data, we wanted to perform a survey to kind of get an understanding of what the corridor is like for the people who frequent it the most. So some of our largest takeaways are up here on the screen. The survey was open for about a month. We got close to 200 responses. So most people drive in this corridor. 40% stated that they do walk, but I will say the caveat to that question is it was like a multiple selection question. So most of the people who said that they walk also use some other mode of transportation in the corridor. Most of the people who are driving in the corridor are going to either Cobb's Corner or to the downtown Canton section of the corridor. And there were a number of concerns that were raised in the survey, high traffic volumes being the most common one. And most respondents want to see a variety of improvements in the corridor, such as reduction in congestion, an increase in safety for all users, and in ease of access to side streets along the corridor and other developments along the corridor. So we collected crash data and turning movement counts as part of this study. And so this diagram here on the screen shows the northern half of Washington Street. So from Sherman Street up here down to High Street, the southern portion of this diagram. These blue circles pop outs are showing the peak hour volumes. So that's your morning peaks and your PM peaks. I know it's a little difficult to read. And then these red overlays show areas of the corridor that were where crashes occurred the most. So from our collection, we saw that most of the corridor is pretty congested during those peak periods. And a lot of the crashes that occurred in this kind of downtown section were rear ends, a lot of side swipes. There's a lot of on-street parking here. And then the crashes on the southern portion of this diagram at High Street, those were a lot of angle crashes because that intersection, as it stands right now, is just it's a stop controlled intersection. So a lot of vehicles turning onto Washington Street from High Street involved in crashes there. So moving on to the southern half of the corridor, this is more of the area around Cobb's Corner. Again, volumes were high during the peak hours at all of these locations. And there were a significant number of crashes at the intersection of Washington Street and Route 27, and then also going east down Route 27 near these entrances to Cobb's Corner and this outlet mall back here. So there's a video that we put together to kind of illustrate some of these concerns that I've highlighted in the previous slides. Let's see if it plays. So this footage, most of it was taken on a Friday, late afternoon, early evening in June. So we're heading southbound on Washington Street. We're going to go through downtown Canton first, and then go into the more residential section of the corridor, and then lastly, be down at Cobb's Corner. So as you can see, at this hour of the day, this is probably around 3:30, 4 o'clock. The corridor is pretty busy. There are a good number of pedestrians. There's a lot of congestion here heading northbound. And you will see a long queue of cars as we head farther south. And those were all cars just waiting to get through that one intersection that we just passed. We're passing High Street right now, heading into the more residential section of the corridor. Now, as you can see, you'll see some pedestrians as well. The pedestrian infrastructure along the corridor kind of varies. It's lacking in some areas, it's robust in others. And as we get into the Cobb's Corner section, again, you can see this center running shared left turn lane, and all of these access points for all these different businesses along Washington Street, all these egress and ingress points. And as we head up to Route 27, this is again, we're heading south. You can see how wide this intersection is and how busy it can get. And then these are just some photos of some of the conditions. A little chaotic trying to get out of the plaza. That was on Route 27. And this is Washington Street. You know, people, not great sidewalk infrastructure here. Things you don't want to see, people walking on the side of the road. Unsafe conditions for anyone who doesn't drive, basically. All right. So hopefully that gave everyone who isn't super familiar with the corridor a good understanding of what's going on there. So we came up with the following objectives after we collected all of our data and did our analysis, and we use these objectives to inform our improvements, which I will be getting into on the next slide. So we wanted to improve safety for all users of the corridor, maintain safe travel speeds, improve and provide safe and comfortable accommodations for people who walk and bike, provide safe and convenient access to adjacent businesses and residences, enhance access management to reduce traffic conflicts, and minimize delays and increase safety at intersections while maintaining efficient traffic flow. So based on adjacent land use along Washington Street in our study area, we split the corridor up into 3 sections. So the northernmost section was our downtown Canton Center section. The middle section we called the residential section, and then the southernmost section was the Cobb's Corner section. So first, I'll be talking about improvements in the northernmost section in the Canton Center area. So this diagram shows Sherman Street down to about Revere. Revere Street is just off the page, but the improvements here are just some realignment and restriping. This northbound approach on Washington Street, repainting to be a through right lane. Right now it's a through left, and it's a right turn exclusive lane. So that would improve through movements through this intersection, and then adding an exclusive left turn lane on the southbound side. And then also improving the crossings here at the commuter rail tracks, and shortening this crossing distance here across Washington Street, which will obviously make it easier to cross the street, but also make pedestrians more visible to those who are driving. Moving on to the second half of this downtown section, a lot of the improvements here are relatively minor, adding some more crossings. As you saw in the video, a lot of there were instances of people crossing just at random spots, or whatever is the most convenient spot for them to cross Washington Street. Some street parking regulations, so prohibiting street parking during those peak periods to improve the flow of traffic through the corridor. There's plenty of off-street parking available, so also improving the wayfinding and signage to those off-street parking options as well. So moving into the residential section, the most significant improvements that we propose here are the addition of a bike lane, which here on this diagram, it's shown as a bike lane in the right of way next to the vehicular lane. And then also an addition of a signal here at this intersection of High Street and Washington Street. So like I said, the bike lane, we came up with 2 options. So as shown on the previous diagram, we showed this bike lane in the street, and then another option is to create a multi-use path on both sides of the roadway. So the bike lane, your bike facility would be separated from the road. And we came up with these cross-section diagrams for each area, but I just wanted to show this one here as an example, and you can look at them all in the report if you'd like. And lastly, the Cobb's Corner section. There were a lot of different improvements that we came up with here, but most notably the consolidation of some of the access points to these businesses here on the east and western sides of Washington Street. Continuation of that bike infrastructure, whether it be through as a bike lane or as a multi-use path. Removing that center running left turn lane, because that was the issue for a lot of the crashes that occurred along this segment of Washington Street. And then we've also proposed down in the plaza some sort of bus shelter, because this plaza is accessed by both Brockton Area Transit and the MBTA. Each of those agencies has a bus route that runs to this plaza. So the benefits from the proposed improvements would include improvement of accommodations for and safety for people who walk and bike in the corridor, improve mobility and safety, sustaining appropriate travel speeds, maintaining efficient traffic operations, supporting and enhancing economic activities, and enhancing the livability for the neighborhoods in Canton and the subregion as a whole. So what we recommend is that in the short term, the downtown Canton, the Canton Center section of the corridor be addressed first. So because most of the improvements are more minor, so it's the restriping, installing some of those crosswalks and some of those on-street parking regulations. And then in the long term, making improvements to the residential section and the Cobb's Corner section. So that would be making some sort of accommodation for bicyclists, whether it be through the bike lane or the multi-use path, signalizing the intersection at High Street and Washington Street, improving access management at the shopping plazas at Cobb's Corner. And these were just more long-term improvements because they're more resource intensive and they're going to take more input from various stakeholders, especially in the Cobb's Corner section, to get these changes made. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions, and my colleague in the TAD group, Seth Asante, is also here. One other thing I wanted to mention is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Yen. He worked on this project. I worked on it with him. He has retired, but this was kind of the last thing that he worked on. So I just wanted to give him credit where credit is due, even though he's not here. I just wanted everyone to know that.
Thank you, Julie. David Moeller has had to leave the meeting, so I'm taking over as chair. Do any members have questions for Julie about this study? Tom O'Rourke.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And thanks, Julie. I can attest to the need for some of those recommended safety improvements in that area. And I like a lot of what I see here. Just curious as to how the reaction has been in Canton. Have you worked with town officials? Have you gotten their feedback and input?
So we worked with a group of different stakeholders, including people from the town of Canton and some like the Canton bike and hike committee and various people who live in Canton or in the region. And I would say it's been mostly mostly positive. And I think a lot of people do want to see changes along the entire corridor. There are a lot of issues there throughout the entire thing with congestion and just, safety is a big issue. The number of crashes, especially down at Cobb's Corner, are pretty high. So yes, I would say it's mostly been positive.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Julie? Okay, seeing none. Thank you for the great work here and for a wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's move on in the agenda. I think the next thing is member items. Is Daniel Amstutz here?
Still here.
So, Daniel, we want to give you a minute. This is your last MPO meeting, I think, and we'd just like to give you a minute to say a few words.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Eric. I'm here to say a few words because I'm leaving the town of Arlington. So I'm going to the private sector and I'm actually going to relocate to Connecticut. So this will be my last Boston MPO meeting, most likely. So just want to say thank you, everyone, for being here, and the CTPS staff for all of their wonderful work. I've been able to see so many really great projects and studies, and the amount of work that staff do are just amazing. And all the really great MPO members here asking really good questions and figuring out, the tip process, and making sure that it gets the best projects are getting funded in the region. So that's all I really wanted to say. I appreciate everyone for being here, and I hope to, connect with you otherwise outside of my work for the town. But I think the new planning director here, Claire Ricker, will likely fill in over the next few months while they search for a replacement for my position.
Daniel, thank you for all your work over the years, both when you were staff at CTPS and then a board member representing Arlington. You've contributed greatly to the MPO process, always asking really good questions, being one of the first people to jump in. So thanks for your time. Thanks for all your support and engagement. Definitely appreciate it. Tegan? Oh, Tegan, I think you're muted. Or... Okay, let me go to Brian.
Just real quick, Daniel, you represent Len Diggins better than Len Diggins can, and I appreciate it. Good luck with your next endeavor.
Thank you.
Let me go back to Tegan.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, great, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to also say something. Daniel, both as your former colleague board member and now as staff supporting you, I also just wanted to thank you for your service and for always being very present and asking really excellent questions, which I think is one of the fundamental things that, as board members can do to make sure that, this is a good process by which you are all making decisions. So thank you so much for your time and commitment. You've been an excellent colleague and board member to support.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Actually, I was putting in a chat, but just want to say great working with you, Daniel, and hoping to cross paths in the future.
Excellent. Are there any other member items? Okay. If not seeing any, can I have a motion to adjourn? Brian Kane?
Move to adjourn.
And second? Tom Bent?
I'll second that motion.
Great. Then without objection, I will declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for a great meeting. Thank you, staff, for some wonderful presentations. I just want to remind folks that we have a UPWP meeting at 1 p.m. So get some lunch. If you're on the UPWP committee, come back at 1 p.m. And thank you, everyone. Take care.